Wow, big day for financial news. I'm sorry that I missed yesterday, but I had my headlights go out conveniently, and I spent many hours yesterday and today trying to fix them until suddenly they started working again. It's just a bad connection. I had my whole dash taken apart and changing out, replacing switches and trying to think about it. Well, gee, I can't figure it out, so I'll just have to completely rewire it from scratch. And then I was thinking, okay, where am I going to drill through the firewall? And I have to go buy relays. And then at the end of the day, it started working again. So that was a lot of work, and that really resulted in nothing. But hey, at least I'm back today. I'm not working on fixing my headlights this afternoon. I have time to talk about the arrest of SBF and the wonderful, oh my gosh, fantastic news. Inflation is only 7.1%. Don't you all feel so much better now? Don't you all feel like your dollar is just going to go that much further now that you know that inflation was only 7.1% instead of 7.4% or 7.3%. I think that was the expectation. It's 0.2% lower than the Wizards of Smart, polled by Dow Jones, who never seemed to know anything, thought it was going to be. So therefore, the Fed is going to cut rates, down to zero or maybe even negative, and stonks will make new highs yet again. That is the narrative we're being fed, and that is what the traders on Wall Street seem to believe. So I guess that means that they think that the Fed is raising the inflation target from 2% to 7%, which honestly wouldn't shock me at this point. The Fed has always been the enemy of the people. They've always been the greatest threat to American prosperity on the planet. And so I wouldn't be shocked if the Fed does do such a thing. But considering tomorrow is Fed Day, when they announce whether or not there's going to be a rate hike, I do still think there's going to be a rate hike tomorrow because it's already been priced in. I think that the markets still expect a 50 basis point hike. Remember, the last one, wasn't the last hike still 75 basis points? Going from 75 basis points, down to 25, that to me, if I were thinking like a Federal Reserve Board member, I would think going from 75 basis points to 25 basis points, that would seem kind of panicky. So I think they want to take a step down. So I still think that they're going to hike by 50. And then after that, perhaps 25, and then nothing. But as much as Wall Street is begging the Fed never to hike again because, oh my gosh, inflation is only 7.1% when the Wizards of Smart thought it would be 7.3%. Obviously, the Fed has hiked way too much, and they need to cut rates down to zero now. I just don't think that that's the Fed style. The Fed moves at a gingerly pace. I do not foresee them turning on a dime like that because that will be interpreted then as the Fed panicking and thinking, oh my gosh, there's an inevitable depression, and they're trying to cut rates to avert that. But hey, we'll find out tomorrow. It might only be, I do think that a 25 basis point hike is possible. I think that no hike, that would very much surprise me. This 25, so 25 is possible. I still think that 50 is most likely because that has been where the expectation has been for a long time, pretty much since the last 75 basis point hike. I think if you go back to that date, even then I was talking about, hey, everybody expects this is the last 75 basis point hike. The next one's going to be 50. If they went from 75 to 25, that's just hard to believe. Because then it seems like the Fed is just overly reactionary. And the Fed doesn't like that. The Fed is very, very reactionary, but they like people to think that they're slow and deliberative and that there's a lot that goes into all their calculations. And if there's just a 7.1% CPI print and then all of a sudden the Fed just, completely pivots, I think that would, in the Fed's mind, undermine their own credibility. So I'm not telling you what I think the Fed should do. I'm telling you what I think they will do based on how they think. So despite what CNBC is saying, inflation is far from over. Even if inflation has peaked, remember the CPI is way underestimated anyway. If you look at shadow stats, which I haven't today, inflation is probably still in the teens by their metric, which is a more accurate metric than the CPI. People can focus on the month-over-month number if they want, but inflation is not measured month-over-month. It's measured year-over-year. So if you look at the year-over-year inflation and it's over 7%, and you call that low, and you say, well, but look at month-over-month. It's like, okay, do you want me to look at month-over-month every time that there's a super high month-over-month inflation? You want me to extrapolate that and annualize it and say to the people who, during, like the last 12 years, for example, when inflation was, in the twos officially, the CPI was in the twos. Yeah, we had some months that were really bad. And if you would annualize those month-over-month numbers, inflation would have been probably like 5%. Did you see people like me screaming from the rooftops going, oh my God, inflation, CPI is 5% this month? No, that would be ridiculous, because even you have to distinguish what sort of numbers you're talking about. CPI, typically, we're talking about it in year-over-year terms. Now you can say CPI is inaccurate, which I do, and provide alternate metrics, which I do, but that's different. When you're talking about the CPI itself, you can't go, oh, well, let's look at the month-over-month. Well, month-over-month ain't bad, so I guess inflation is over. Stop it. Inflation will be over when people can afford to live again. Wages have nowhere near caught up with inflation, so therefore inflation's not over. That's when inflation really ends. But of course, it never ends because people's standards of living never catch up. You can't work the same job, even if you get even if you're getting pay raises or whatever. You can't keep working the same job and maintain the same standard of living. People who are paupers today would have been firmly middle class 20 years ago. The reason for this is that we have a financial and monetary system that penalizes people who produce goods and services. People who work and actually make the things that we consume as a society are chumps. They constantly get poorer and poorer. Those who get ahead in society are those who own assets and sit on them and hodl them. So I think that's all I have to say on CPI for today. We will address the Fed tomorrow. But for the remainder of this discussion, I would like to turn my attention to Sam Bankman-Fried, the very odd former CEO of FTX, a crypto exchange that blew up out of nowhere and went bankrupt before I even knew it existed. He has been charged with a litany of crimes like fraud and probably money laundering and whatever else by the Department of Justice of the United States. He's being extradited from the Bahamas. He apparently is going to, have an extradition hearing where he will probably argue that he shouldn't be extradited. But this is very strange because SBF was all over TV and all over the podcast verse and getting very friendly interviews from, establishment media mouthpieces like the New York Times. And based on that, it looks like, well, he must be pretty confident that he's going to be protected and not face any consequences, because he's not doing what someone who is facing criminal charges would do, which is shut up and prepare your defense. Instead, he was out blabbing his mouth, incriminating himself all over the internet, which made me think, well, at least he thinks that he's not really under any serious criminal threat. But enter Caroline Ellison, also known as Queen Caroline by certain factions of the alt-right, according to Forbes magazine. She appeared in all her beauty and glory on the island of Manhattan at a coffee shop where a eagle-eyed onlooker snapped a photo of her conversing with a barista, who later confirmed that yes, it was Caroline Ellison who graced him with her presence. She had also apparently retained a Clinton lawyer and was believed to be cooperating with the Department of Justice. And so what many people suspected on that date, only a couple weeks ago, was that Caroline had completely betrayed SBF and that she was going to, spill the dirt on whatever it was to incriminate him and protect herself with the help of this Clinton lawyer who once called, I believe, Merrick Garland, the current U.S. Attorney General, her wingman. So it appears that SBF was mistaken, or perhaps just really that stupid, and he was not under any protection. It turns out that he was, in the end, a patsy, the front man to a much bigger scandal and fraudulent organization that he only had a cursory understanding of. Same goes for Caroline Ellison. She doesn't seem to be someone who is particularly talented at her job, based on interviews of her that were, pre-existed on the internet, just people asking her about, normal stuff about the operations of her business. She didn't really seem like she understood what Alameda Capital really did. But instead of exposing the big players, who no doubt are too big and too powerful for the DOJ to go after, they are making an example out of SBF as the figurehead, and really probably going to put him through the ringer, and that's about it. Kind of like how, Ghislaine Maxwell was prosecuted for trafficking minors to nobody. SBF and the great network which surrounded him and benefited from his fraudulent activities and facilitated his entire career, they will receive no scrutiny, no mention, not even a passing acknowledgement. I'm not saying it's the exact same people as with Epstein. I don't think they're the same group of people, but I'm saying just like Epstein did not on his own, rise to power in the financial world just based on his own skill. He wasn't some just, financial guru, high school dropout who made himself into a billionaire. Jeffrey Epstein was handed his identity, his wealth, and his life in exchange for serving as a patsy, as a frontman. And I think SBF is a very similar sort of character. I don't think that this only marginally functional human being could have built FTX into what it is, or what it was before it collapsed, without the support of a very powerful network of individuals, without being brought up by these people, nurtured by them since he was an undergrad in college. SBF was another manufactured billionaire, and since he has outlived his usefulness, he will be disposed of, just like Epstein. In fact, when he got arrested yesterday, the term Epstein was Epstein, like Epstein ED, was trending higher, at least from when I looked, than SBF's own name. Because that's all people could talk about was like, wow, he got arrested, now they're going to whack him. But honestly, he's so stupid, I think that they can let him go to trial, and he probably won't expose all of the big players around him, like the what were they called? Authentic altruists or something? Effective altruists, that's what it is. Who seem to have supported him and, built him up into a billionaire. And of course, they'll be able to use him as the poster child for why we need to regulate cryptocurrency and make sure that people can't trade Bitcoin except on a secured, Federal Reserve adjacent exchange. If you trade Bitcoin peer-to-peer, that's going to be illegal. That's going to be the new thing. They're going to say this was the problem with FTX, was the people were trading Bitcoin peer-to-peer. Not that had anything to do with FTX. FTX is quite the opposite. But even I, as not a Bitcoin guy, can understand where they're going to take this story. The average citizen, understands cryptocurrency even less than I do. And, all they need to be told is, yellow coin dad. And I think that most of them will buy it to a certain extent. And I think it will be broadly bipartisan. I mean, even, a political outsider like Donald Trump, I think, would happily sign a bill that heavily restricted the use of cryptocurrencies and, effectively outlawed them to the point that, they're no longer useful. Now, is that going to happen immediately? Hopefully not. But, as it stands, I don't think that there's really anybody to stand against it. And they could just do it through the SEC, classify Bitcoin and all these other cryptos as securities. So all in all, not a lot of good news today. Things actually seem, pretty bad, as they usually do. But, it's times like this when the horrors in the world are, concentrated in America. When I'm much happier on this channel when I can talk about terrible things going on in the rest of the world. Because I can feel more detached from that. I can get upset about that, and say, like, oh my gosh, war in Yemen, terrible, war in Ukraine, so bad. Which, by the way, I haven't talked about Yemen in a long time. Seems like the Yemen war's wrapped up more or less. Which, maybe after the vote. There's supposed to be a vote this week in Congress on Yemen. We'll see where that goes. A war powers resolution, they're trying it again. Hopefully Biden will sign it. Trump vetoed the war powers resolution on Yemen a few years ago in 2019. It's one of the reasons why Trump was a really bad guy. He took blood money from Raytheon. The Raytheon execs went to his office and said, "Oh my gosh, you can't veto, or you can't sign this war powers resolution and end this war in the Middle East that's helping arm Al Qaeda, because Al Qaeda is using our rockets and missiles, and so we're making a lot of money off of helping Al Qaeda." And Trump decided, you know what, I'm going to help Al Qaeda because the Raytheon guys are making a lot of money off of it. So that's Trump. He's the president of, taxpayer-funded Al-Qaeda. But anyway, that's a tangent that I shouldn't get into today. It really has nothing to do with that. But, anyway, getting back to what I was saying, I can talk about that and not, get so depressed, because, that's over there, and I'm over here. But when I'm talking about stuff going on over here, it just sucks, because it's like, I live here. I don't want bad things to happen where I live. And so it's good to find things outside of current events that you can use, not to lull yourself to sleep, but to distract yourself for a little bit every day. I think at least a couple hours of, entertainment a day is healthy. Stuff, it can still exercise your brain, it can still be stimulating, but not something that's going to depress you. Just to give yourself a break. So, with that said, with that life advice out of the way, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.